I knew I was an animal. I'd studied evolution, I'd studied biology, and I'd loved it. I knew where that tree of life was, and I knew where humans fitted into that. And it was kind of wonderful to be part of that. I remember when I first discovered it, it was really kind of mind-blowing. But it was knowledge that I had in my head, it was knowledge that I learnt from books. And it wasn't until I went out to Tanzania to work as an anthropologist that it became something that I knew in my body, something that became lived. I went to Tanzania in my early 20s to work with people called the Tutog. They lived in land that was next to the Serengeti National Park and Ngorongoro Crater, where all those amazing wildlife films are made. It was semi-arid land, so what that meant was that when the rains came for 3 months of the year, it was lush green and there'd be a carpet of flowers and all the trees would sprout their leaves and life kind of came into blossoming. But for the rest of the year, there was no rain at all and all became really dry and really desiccated and the ground became sandy and it was a very tough environment. The Tutog herded cattle and goats and sheep, and they'd done that for millennium down there, and they were living a very traditional life. And their homes consisted of these kind of rectangular mud huts that were made of interwoven branches cut from the local trees, and they were plastered with cow dung. And the roofs of the hut were made in the same way, but because of the dung and the fertility, all these plants would grow in the roofs. And so there'd be this like kind of living hat on top, and there'd be insects in there and birds, and during the rainy season they became kind of green and lush in their own right, with this whole host of creatures living in the houses that the Tutog were living in. And surrounding a group of huts would be this big thick thorn fence cut from local acacia trees, and the idea was that it kept the cattle and the goats and the sheep in at night, and it kept the lions and the hyenas and the leopards out. That area, that whole tropic area, is very near the equator, and what that means is that dusk falls very, very quickly. So at 6 o'clock it's still light, and by 6:30 it can be pitch black. And because it's so far from towns or any kind of habitation, there's no light pollution. So when it's black, there's no glow on the horizon, it's just dark. And I was out there one day during the dry season, and I was sat outside a hut cooking supper on 3 stones with a pot and some firewood, and it was already dark, and it was a dark night, when really quite suddenly this kind of orange glow started on the horizon, and it got brighter and brighter and brighter, and it was this kind of fiery, luminous orange, and it was so bright and so luminous that I thought it might be a wildfire. That time of year fires were not uncommon because all the vegetation was so dry. And I was really quite scared, and I didn't know what to do, and should I be getting in the Land Rover and driving away, or what was going on? Nobody else in the household seemed particularly bothered about it. And it was clearly a long way away on the horizon, so I thought I'd wait for a bit. And as I waited and looked at it, I then saw the beginning of this just fiery orange orb coming above the horizon. And then it rose a bit higher, and I saw more of the orb and more of the orb. And I realised this was the biggest and reddest moon I'd ever seen in my life. Today we'd call it a harvest moon or a supermoon. I'd never heard those terms. I'd never seen anything like this. It was just beautiful. And as it rose higher and higher and the whole globe became visible, it changed from this fiery orange to kind of yellow to white. And at that point you could see everything. I mean, the world was clear, and there were shadows. We were all making shadows, and those shadows were as crisp as they were under the midday sun. it was as though the whole world had been remade in shades of luminous grey. And as I sat outside with this extraordinary light, it was quite a quiet night in the household. So the women were grinding maize, and there was the sound of them grinding maize, which they do by hand between two stones. And every so often a calf would call to its mum. And the kind of crickets would be chirping in the background, and then they'd kind of come up to this crescendo, and then that would go down again. But it was kind of a real sense of peace, and the noises were all quiet, beautiful noises of the night. And as I sat with this moon and this light and the noises of that night, the world was bigger and deeper and vaster than I'd ever experienced. And I felt myself to be this tiny node of life in this much bigger connected node of life. And although I was this tiny, infinitesimal, small node of life, I could feel that I was connected to every other tiny node of life. And I was part of that web in a way that I'd never felt before. And it was really powerful and extraordinary. And I sat there for a long, long time as the moon rose, just letting it wash through me and allowing it in. But eventually tiredness got the better of me, and I decided to go to bed, or my body decided that I was going to bed. And at that point I was sleeping in a toque hut, and beds were made of this, again, interwoven, a platform made of interwoven branches cut from a tree. And it was covered with hides from cattle and from goats and from sheep. It wasn't very comfortable, but I was a lot younger, and it was fine. And as I went to sleep that night, I took the numinosity of the experience with me as I drifted off and into my dreams. I was woken before 5 a.m. by my body, every single inch of which was demanding to be scratched. I slept under a mosquito net, but either it slipped during the night, or I hadn't tucked it in, with the experience had been so overwhelming. I hadn't tucked it in, I don't know which, but I had been subject to a feeding frenzy by every flea and tick and mosquito. It felt like for 100 miles round. I'm sure it wasn't. And my body was so inflamed and so uncomfortable, and it was just so awful. And I so didn't know what to do. In a masochistic moment, I decided to count the bites. There were 27 on my face alone. I gave up after counting 109 on my body. And as I sat there, just in this agony, there was this tiny little voice off to the side of my head that went, "This too is what it means to be a node of life in a much larger system of life. For those insects that fed off you last night, your numinous experience under the moon counted for absolutely nothing. The fact that you're a human being counts for absolutely nothing. What matters to them is that you are a source of blood that was going to let them lead their lives and have their offspring. You were food for them, and you were part of their ecosystem, and an absolutely crucial part of their ecosystem too. And although you might not like that, and although it may feel very different to what you felt the night before, it's the other side of that same coin. If you're part of this system, you're part of this system. And with those two experiences that happened within 12 hours of each other, what I knew in my head, what I'd learnt from books, became imprinted into the cells of my body and my being. And my sense of the world and of my place in it was changed forever.